There are people right now having full conversations with themselves when no one's around, not just thinking quietly, actually speaking out loud, verbalizing their thoughts, arguing with themselves, narrating their actions, rehearsing conversations, sometimes even using different voices or personas. And if you think this is just harmless eccentricity or a quirky habit, the neuroscience reveals something far more complex. The brain that needs to externalize internal dialogue through speech is processing reality, emotion, and self-concept differently than brains that keep thoughts internal. Today, we're exploring why some people can't keep their thoughts silent, and the research shows this isn't about being crazy or talking to imaginary friends. It's about a mind that's found that thoughts become more real, more manageable, or more bearable when spoken into existence. Let me start with research that distinguishes normal internal monologue from compulsive self-talk. A 2020 study published in Consciousness and Cognition surveyed over 4,500 adults about their private speech patterns. They found that 96% engaged in some form of talking to themselves occasionally, but 23% reported doing so regularly or compulsively when alone. For this subset, self-talk wasn't an occasional thing. It was their primary mode of thought processing, occurring multiple hours per day, sometimes continuously throughout solitary periods. The researchers distinguished between functional self-talk, using speech to aid concentration or problem-solving, and what they called compulsive externalized dialogue, where the person couldn't process thoughts internally and needed to speak them aloud to make them feel real or manageable. Brain imaging revealed that these weren't just different frequencies of the same behavior. They involved different neural patterns and served different psychological functions. Before we go deeper, you need to understand what's happening neurologically when you talk to yourself versus think silently. Research published in 2019 in Brain and Language examined the neural circuits involved in inner speech versus overt speech. Both activate Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the brain's language production and comprehension regions. But overt speech, actually speaking aloud, additionally activates motor cortex for articulation, auditory cortex for hearing your own voice, and creates a stronger sensory trace in memory. This means that thoughts spoken aloud are processed more deeply and remembered more vividly than thoughts kept internal. The act of speaking engages more neural systems, creating richer, more concrete mental representations. For some people, this enhanced processing isn't optional. Their brain requires the additional sensory feedback of hearing their own voice to effectively process thoughts, regulate emotions, or organize cognition. The internal monologue isn't sufficient. It needs to be externalized. The study found that people who compulsively talk to themselves showed weaker internal speech networks, measured by reduced connectivity between language regions during silent thought tasks. Their brain had difficulty generating and maintaining verbal thought without overt vocalization. It wasn't that they chose to talk aloud. Their cognitive architecture required it for thoughts to feel substantial, real, or processed. Now let's talk about the developmental and psychological factors that create compulsive self-talk. A groundbreaking 2018 study published in Developmental Psychology examined the childhood origins of adult self-talk patterns. They found that all children talk to themselves extensively during ages 2 to 7. This is called private speech, and it's a normal part of cognitive development. Children verbalize their thinking as they learn to plan, problem solve, and regulate behavior. Typically, this external private speech gradually becomes internalized by age 7 to 10, transforming into silent inner speech. But the study found that some children never fully internalize this process. Adults who talk to themselves compulsively often had either continued their childhood pattern into adulthood or had returned to it after periods of stress, trauma, or isolation. Their development of internal speech had been disrupted, or their internal speech system had regressed under psychological strain. The researchers identified several risk factors for persistent external self-talk. Children who grew up in chaotic environments with minimal adult verbal interaction often maintained external speech longer because they hadn't received adequate scaffolding for developing internal dialogue. Children with language processing differences or ADHD often needed external speech to maintain focus and organization. Children who experienced significant loneliness or lack of conversational partners sometimes maintained self-talk as a form of social connection with themselves. Let's examine the specific functions that self-talk serves. A 2021 study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology had people who regularly talked to themselves wear recording devices for a week, capturing their actual self-talk in natural settings. Analysis revealed several distinct categories of self-talk, each serving different functions. The first category was task-oriented self-talk, narrating actions and providing self-instruction. Okay, now I need to add the flour. Where did I put my keys? Turn left at the next light. This type enhanced focus and performance, particularly on complex or mundane tasks. The vocalization kept attention engaged and provided external structure for sequential activities. People using task-oriented self-talk showed improved task completion and fewer errors compared to silent performance. The second category was social rehearsal, practicing conversations before they happened or replaying conversations that already occurred. I should have said, if they ask me that, I'll say, why did I say it that way? This served anxiety management and social processing functions. The person was using self-talk to prepare for or analyze social interactions, treating themselves as both conversation partner and audience. This was most common in socially anxious individuals who needed extensive processing around social exchanges. The third category was emotional regulation self-talk, speaking to themselves in soothing, encouraging, or critical ways. You can do this. It's going to be okay. What were you thinking? That was so stupid. This represented externalized internal dialogue with different aspects of self. The person was essentially having conversations between different parts of their psyche: the anxious self and the reassuring self, the critical parent voice and the wounded child, the doubtful self and the confident self. The fourth category was companionship self-talk, treating themselves as a companion or audience. Well, that was interesting. Let's see what we should do next. We need to remember to... This was most common in people who spent extensive time alone and appeared to serve a loneliness reduction function. The self-talk created a sense of presence, of not being completely alone, of having an audience for one's experiences even in solitude. Research on the neuroscience of self-talk reveals why it can be compulsive for some people. A 2020 study published in Neuroimage examined brain activity in people who regularly talked to themselves versus those who rarely did. The frequent self-talkers showed altered activity in the default mode network, the brain system active during rest and self-referential thought. Specifically, they showed less cohesive activity, suggesting fragmented self-processing that required external vocalization to integrate. They also showed heightened activity in emotional regulation regions, the anterior cingulate cortex and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, during self-talk. The researchers proposed that self-talk served as an emotion regulation strategy for people whose internal regulation systems were less effective. By externalizing thoughts and speaking to themselves in regulating ways, they achieved emotional control that they couldn't achieve through purely internal processes. The study found that self-talk particularly increased during stress or emotional distress. When calm, even habitual self-talkers reduced their vocalization. But when anxious, sad, or overwhelmed, self-talk dramatically increased. This suggested it was a stress response behavior, a coping mechanism activated when the internal regulatory system was overwhelmed and needed external support through vocalization. Let's talk about self-talk and loneliness, because the relationship is complex and bidirectional. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology examined self-talk frequency in relation to social connection. They found a U-shaped relationship. People with very rich social lives and people with very limited social lives both talk to themselves more than those with moderate social connection. For the socially connected group, self-talk served processing functions, helping them analyze and integrate extensive social experiences. For the socially isolated group, self-talk served companionship functions, filling the void left by absent human interaction. But the quality and content differed significantly. Socially connected self-talkers engaged in social rehearsal and reflection. Socially isolated self-talkers engaged in companionship talk, treating themselves as their primary conversational partner. The researchers found that loneliness-driven self-talk, while providing some comfort, also maintained isolation by providing just enough social-like interaction to reduce the urgency of seeking actual human connection. It was a coping mechanism that paradoxically prevented the behavior, seeking connection, that would address the root problem. People were essentially in relationships with themselves that substituted for, rather than supplemented, relationships with others. Research on self-talk and mental health reveals important patterns. A 2021 meta-analysis published in Clinical Psychology Review analyzed 87 studies on self-talk and psychopathology. They found that self-talk itself wasn't pathological, but certain types and qualities predicted poor mental health outcomes. Negative self-talk, harsh self-criticism spoken aloud, predicted depression and low self-esteem. Command hallucinations or self-talk that felt involuntary or not fully under the person's control predicted psychotic symptoms. But positive or neutral self-talk, particularly task-oriented or problem-solving self-talk, actually correlated with better cognitive performance and didn't predict mental health problems. The key distinction was agency and valence. If the person felt in control of their self-talk and it was neutral or positive in content, it was adaptive. If it felt compulsive, was predominantly negative, or included elements of losing reality testing, believing the different voices were actually separate entities, it indicated pathology. The meta-analysis found that self-talk increased during depressive episodes, anxiety states, and psychotic episodes. But the self-talk was consequence more than cause. The underlying condition increased self-talk as the person struggled to manage symptoms through externalized dialogue. The self-talk was an attempt at self-regulation when internal regulation was failing. Let's examine the social consequences of being overheard talking to yourself. A 2020 study published in Social Psychological and Personality Science examined social perceptions of people who talk to themselves. Participants watched videos of people engaging in various activities, some talking to themselves and some silent. Those talking to themselves were rated as significantly less competent, less socially skilled, more likely to have mental health issues, and more strange or eccentric. This created a challenging situation for people who relied on self-talk. They functioned better, thought more clearly, regulated emotions more effectively when talking to themselves. But the behavior made them appear less functional to others who observed it. Many self-talkers learned to suppress the behavior in public, waiting until they were alone to externalize their thoughts. This suppression itself required cognitive resources and often resulted in poorer performance on tasks they couldn't talk themselves through. The study found that self-talkers often experienced shame about the behavior, viewing it as childish, crazy, or socially unacceptable. They went to great lengths to ensure privacy before allowing themselves to talk aloud. Some reported intense relief when finally alone and able to speak their thoughts. Others described feeling trapped in their own head during long periods when they couldn't vocalize without being overheard. Research on different personas or voices used during self-talk reveals complexity in self-concept. A 2019 study published in Consciousness and Cognition interviewed people who used different voices or personas when talking to themselves. Some switched between first person, I need to focus, and second person, you need to focus, or even third person, she needs to focus. Others had distinct voices representing different aspects of self: a critical voice, a compassionate voice, a playful voice, a logical voice. Brain imaging during these shifts showed activation patterns consistent with perspective taking and theory of mind, the same systems used to understand other people's mental states. The person was essentially treating different parts of themselves as different agents with different perspectives. This wasn't necessarily pathological. It could represent sophisticated self-reflection where the person examined situations from multiple internal viewpoints. But the researchers identified a continuum. At one end, flexible perspective shifting in self-talk, where the person clearly maintained awareness that all voices were aspects of themselves. At the other end, dissociative self-talk, where the voices felt separate, autonomous, not fully under the person's control. The latter predicted dissociative disorders and required clinical attention. The former was within normal variation of complex self-talk. Let's talk about cultural factors, because acceptance of self-talk varies dramatically across cultures. A 2020 cross-cultural study published in Culture and Psychology examined attitudes toward talking to oneself across 32 countries. In some cultures, particularly those with strong individualist orientations and emphasis on internal mental life, self-talk was seen as strange or concerning. In others, particularly those with more fluid boundaries between internal and external expression, self-talk was more normalized. The study found that in cultures where self-talk was more stigmatized, people did it less in public but similarly frequently in private, suggesting the behavior was universal, but its expression was culturally shaped. In cultures where it was more accepted, people were more comfortable vocalizing thoughts, even in semi-public spaces. The behavior itself didn't vary much cross-culturally, but the shame and concealment around it did. Research on the relationship between self-talk and creativity reveals interesting connections. A 2021 study published in Thinking Skills and Creativity found that people who regularly talked to themselves during creative work showed enhanced creative output. The externalization of thought allowed them to hold more ideas in working memory simultaneously, to hear ideas that sounded wrong when spoken aloud, and to engage in more dynamic problem solving. Artists, writers, and inventors often reported extensive self-talk during creative processes. They described arguing with themselves about ideas, talking through problems aloud, even creating dialogues between different conceptual approaches. The self-talk seemed to serve as external cognitive scaffolding that enhanced the creative process. The study suggested that the stigma around self-talk might be suppressing a cognitively beneficial behavior. Now let's examine what happens when people who rely on self-talk are forced into extended social company where they can't vocalize. A 2020 study in cognitive science tracked self-talkers during a week-long group retreat where they shared rooms and had minimal private time. Participants reported significant cognitive difficulties, trouble concentrating, forgetting things, difficulty processing emotions, sense of thoughts being stuck in their head. Physiological monitoring showed increased stress markers, elevated cortisol, and reduced heart rate variability during the social period compared to their normal routine. The inability to engage in their typical self-talk created genuine stress and impaired functioning. Some participants sought out bathrooms or walks alone specifically to have brief opportunities to talk to themselves and clear their head. This suggested that for people whose cognitive architecture relied on externalized speech, the suppression required in constant company was genuinely taxing, not just uncomfortable. It was like forcing someone who thinks visually to function without being able to look at anything, or forcing someone who processes kinesthetically to remain completely still. The self-talk wasn't optional. It was their cognitive operating system. For those watching who recognize that you talk to yourself extensively when alone, who might feel shame about it or worry that it means something's wrong with you, understand first that you're not alone, and you're probably not pathological. Most people engage in some self-talk. The question isn't whether you do it, but why and how it functions for you. If your self-talk is predominantly positive or neutral, if it helps you think clearly, regulate emotions, or accomplish tasks, if you feel in control of it and it's not distressing, then it's likely an adaptive cognitive strategy, not a problem. Your brain has found that externalizing thought enhances processing, and that's fine. You're not crazy. You're using a tool that works for your cognitive style. If your self-talk is predominantly negative, if you're speaking to yourself in ways you'd never speak to another person, if it's harsh criticism or hopeless rumination, that's worth addressing. Not because talking to yourself is problematic, but because the content is harmful. You're essentially abusing yourself verbally, and doing it out loud makes it more powerful and memorable. That pattern can be changed through therapeutic work that addresses the internal critical voice. If your self-talk includes elements where it feels like the voices are not you, where you lose awareness that you're talking to yourself, where the speech feels compulsive or beyond your control, that's worth professional evaluation. The line between complex self-talk and dissociative symptoms or psychotic features requires clinical assessment. Most self-talk doesn't cross that line, but when it does, intervention can help. If your self-talk is driven primarily by loneliness, by lack of human conversation partners, recognize that while it provides some comfort, it's not a substitute for actual human connection. You're essentially in a relationship with yourself that's filling the space where relationships with others should be. The self-talk is a symptom of isolation that deserves attention, not judgment. The solution isn't to stop talking to yourself, it's to create opportunities for talking to others. For those who don't talk to themselves and find the behavior strange when they encounter it, try to understand that different minds process information differently. Some people think primarily in images, some in words, some in sensations, some in abstract concepts. Some people need to externalize their verbal thinking to process it effectively. It's not more strange than any other cognitive diversity. It's just more visible and therefore more stigmatized. The research is clear. Self-talk is a normal human behavior that exists on a continuum from occasional to constant, from functional to dysfunctional, from adaptive to pathological. Most self-talk falls in the adaptive range, serving legitimate cognitive and emotional functions. The stigma around it does more harm than the behavior itself, creating shame that leads people to suppress a strategy that actually helps them function. If you talk to yourself, stop hiding it like it's something shameful. It's how your brain works. It's how you process the world. As long as it's not hurting you or preventing you from functioning, it's fine. Maybe it even helps you function better than you would silently. The people who judge you for it are judging a cognitive style they don't understand. Your brain found a strategy that works. That's not crazy. That's adaptive. And maybe the world would be better if more people externalized their thinking instead of keeping everything locked inside until it becomes toxic rumination that never gets processed or challenged. The voice in your head becomes more real when you speak it into existence. Sometimes that's exactly what you need, to make your thoughts real enough to examine, challenge, organize, or release. The silence that society demands isn't always golden. Sometimes it's just a cage for thoughts that need to be spoken, heard, and processed. And if you need to speak to yourself to make that happen, then speak. You're not crazy. You're human, with a mind that works in ways that require vocalization to function optimally. There's nothing wrong with that.